Hello and welcome to the Focusing Way podcast. I'm your host, David Battistella. Today on the Focusing Way podcast, our guest is Barbara Dickinson. Barbara Dickinson finished a long career at the United States Federal Reserve in 2010 and now consults on strategic organizational improvement. She has earned, among other credentials, certification as a strengths performance coach from the Gallup organization. In 2006, she learned the practice called focusing, completing her certification as a focusing professional in 2009. And is now an enthusiastic learner and teacher of the many facets of focusing and the related practice, thinking at the edge. After volunteering her services to the Focusing Institute as a management consultant in 2011 and 2012, Barbara decided to share her expertise more widely as a strengths-oriented consultant interested in helping individuals and nonprofit organizations innovate, think, and work at their edge, improve emotional intelligence, and build better teams. She's especially interested in applying this interactive focusing method to help people form healthier relationships at all levels. Barbara lives in New Jersey with Holly, her Jack Russell Terrier. And joining me now is Barbara Dickinson. Barbara, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, David. It's so nice to be here with you today.
I'm very excited about our conversation today. But just before we begin and dive in, what I'd like to ask you first is if you could just tell me and our listeners a little bit about how you came to focusing or how you found focusing, like that story of how you found focusing.
Sure. I've been a focuser for 10 years, and I'm not a therapist, but I did learn about it from a therapist who kind of said, there's a book, go read it, see what you think. And so I read Eugene Genlin's Focusing, and I tried to do it myself, and that didn't work. So I found a workshop and started to incorporate focusing into my life. And in the 10 years since I began to do that, I have studied with several of the master teachers of focusing, which delights me because my style is kind of an amalgam of everything I've learned from all of these great people. I took a number of Ann Weiser Cornell's classes. I went to summer school several times and studied for the week with Ann was the first time, and then with Kevin McEvenew, and another time with Nada Liu. And that time I'm pretty sure it was Thinking at the Edge, which of course isn't focusing, but it's based on focusing, and one of my favorite practices. I then studied with Robert Lee, who has his domain focusing, and got my certification as a trainer with him. Although what I would teach, if I did teach workshops, would be traditional focusing. I then took a dive deeper into Thinking at the Edge and have stayed with that. And at the same time, two other things happened. I met one of the world's master teachers of interactive focusing and have learned with her. And I'm very proud to say she's also my focusing partner, Masumi Maeda from Japan. And I also had the opportunity to work as a consultant with the Focusing Institute, which led to spending a year working with Mary and Jean Genlin on a variety of things. Including getting to be a focusing partner of Jean's, which I think it's fair to say it doesn't get much better than that.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was fun and inspiring, and to being in the visionary soup with Jean for
Mm-hmm.
that. Um, since that time, I've deepened my practice with interactive focusing, with thinking at the edge. I don't know if I'm unusual or if my friends just say that I'm unusual in the focusing world, but I have anywhere from 6 to 8 focusing partners at any given time. And I have at least 2 or 3 focusing sessions a week. That's
Wow.
that's how important this practice is to me. So that kind of, I mean, I've done a bunch of other things. I've been to international conferences. I was happily in Cambridge last year and did an interest group on interactive focusing, which was very inspiring. There were 12 people in the room, all keenly interested. And then I was able to attend Masumi Maida's workshop earlier this summer on interactive focusing. I sort of unofficially attended the Focusing Oriented Therapists conference in New York and sat through her workshop again. I don't think I could take it too many times. It's really valuable. I learn something new about that practice every time I do.
Yeah. You touched on something that's really interesting to me and something I like to share, but also something that's quite curious because, you know, let's talk about the different styles that have emerged. Like there's sort of the Gendlin model, which starts the sort of process, but focusing is kind of unique in that there's a kind of openness to people developing their own styles. You talked about training with different teachers, but what does that really say about focusing, that there's room and space for these styles and these different forms of teaching focusing to develop?
But for me, it all goes back to a conversation I remember having with Mary Hendricks Gendlin, and we were talking about focusing as a form of literacy. It's a basic human skill, and I started to think, yeah, it's kind of like reading and writing and arithmetic. And then there's emotional literacy, and that's where focusing comes in. So if you think of it in those terms, mathematics and reading and writing have all been the underpinnings of a vast array of skills and abilities and products and art forms, and so is focusing. It tackles the basic human function, if you will, of integrating ourselves, becoming one with our felt senses, the emotional quality of those, the impact those have on our life, and how we want to live our life forward. And given the number of unique individuals there are in the world, it's easy to imagine focusing sort of blossoming in many different forms.
Yeah, there's something kind of beautiful that it can shift and adapt, whereas mathematics also sort of grows in its way, but its underpinning is some kind of like very sort of structured environment. I guess the underpinnings of focusing would be sort of safety and partnership and sort of maybe egalitarian, the sort of egalitarian exchange of in a focusing partnership that each person is giving of themselves inside that partnership that creates a kind of safe place to explore those things. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I really like the way you said that. And I was thinking about what a nice natural move we're making from the one person as focuser to the partnership in focusing. And the thing that's the most important to me is what you just described, is that mutually respectful recognition of the two equal beings in the partnership, and also the sort of guidelines that we have for listening: no judgment, no no criticism, no advice giving. We are there in focusing partnership to truly hear another human being and then to be heard ourselves.
Mm-hmm. I think I've often heard Jean, or the thing I like the most, one of the things I like the most about Jean's teaching is that fundamentally we are sitting across from another human being, and that needs to be our first realization. But in a busy world and in a world where we meet a lot of people and we have a lot of interactions, we don't always sort of pause to reflect and take the time that what is in front of us often is another human being, and that recognition is sort of the very start of a focusing partnership, that you are present to another person, they are present to you.
Exactly. When I was listening to you, I was letting your words unfold almost like we were entering into a partnership session, and realizing how important it is to me to keep the little introduction that I do with my partners the same every time. I've had partners for years, but we don't take shortcuts. We say the same things to each other to enter into the partnership every single time, no matter how many years it's been. It's almost as if it's a little litany that we recite, but it creates that doorway into the safe space of the partnership, the respect for the other human being who's there. And for me, as I hear what you had to say, it brings to me the difference, the enormous difference between a focusing partnership or a focusing attitude in listening to other people, or a focusing oriented conversation, and the normal form of conversation where we can often be in competition with each other. We can be afraid of each other, even just a little nervous. This isn't someone I know. What is he or she going to say? Mm-hmm. Or we might even be in conflict with the other person. And the safety and, if you will, the soundness, the wholeness of the focusing partnership is so different from that.
Just as you were saying that, and sort of what comes through for me, and hearing what's important to you, sort of the two words that came while you were describing the words you use at the beginning of any focusing partnership was sort of like a ritual honoring, so that those words repeat themselves in a way that at each interaction, or to begin any exchange, there's the ritual of honoring the practice you're about to enter into. I almost get the sort of image of sort of masters of almost anything, always when they meet each other, they honor each other in a way.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? Like, there's even in the sort of martial arts, let's say, there's a bow, to begin. Not that I would compare, a focusing session to going into that kind of physical kind of interaction, but it's more that those words that sort of came to me as you were describing it, I was experiencing that as kind of ritual honoring, and honoring in a respectful way a practice that's about to unfold. But then each time making it sort of fresh, like coming to those words each time, sort of in a very present moment kind of way.
I like the way you described that, and I also like I guess it's the analogy of the martial arts, because that bow that you give your opponent, so we're not going to go there because that's not what focusing's about, but the bow, the ritual, the opening of a focusing session, yes, these feel similar to me inside as ways of honoring that there is a human being in front of me. That human being has as much value in this world as I do. We are equals. We bring as much of our humanity to this session as our partner does. And at the same time, thinking about, for example, in a religious service, there is a litany, there's a series of words, and there may even be music that are repeated each time the group gathers together, or we could think of that as each time the partnership forms. And there's a tricky place where you might recite those words and that music by rote without thinking about their meaning. But in my focusing sessions, I want those invitations, those couple of little questions we ask, but also the closing of the focusing to be real to me and to my partner. I'm reminded that sometimes my partners and I get so enthusiastic about a topic that we have trouble waiting for the focuser to actually finish, but we always do. And then we'll say something like, have you come to a resting place? And we won't speak whatever's on our minds until the focuser acknowledges, yes, I'm done. My focusing turn is ended. I'm at a resting place. And I mean, these are people I've been in close focusing partnership with for a while. And if one of us has something that we want to ask, maybe about the process, of course, respectfully of the other person's content, but those are the kinds of things you want to wait till the end. And that little bit of respect for the process that's given to me, that I give to my partner, is so important. This thing that we're doing, it is sacred. Yeah. And I'm not bringing religion into the space here. That isn't my point. It's sacred to the humanness of us.
Well, you're bringing the sacred part. I mean, I know that you're not bringing religion into it, but you're bringing the good stuff that, in that sense, you know what I mean? Like maybe people are attracted initially to religions because of the sacredness of the process, right? What happens out of that, what evolves out of that can be different experiences. But when you talk about the sacredness of the space, it's like focusing partners can create within their sphere, and they know it intimately. I'm sure you've had the experience with your partners, and I certainly have with mine, but kind of a space that is so delicate and true and spacious and safe, that it creates a kind of the room for us to explore within an environment that can be totally safe and creates a kind of whole new freshness, a whole new perspective on one's own experience.
That feels right. As I was experiencing what you were saying, which is kind of interesting considering this whole notion about interaction. I'm listening to you. I'm listening both for the essence of how it is for you and the emotions that might be there. And at the same time, I can't avoid that something forms in me. It does. And what formed in me had to do with the word safe. And it was a long time that I was focusing before I encountered the interactive form of focusing, and it was a while before it felt like that could be safe to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going back and checking my own sentence, because one of the things that has struck me as I have become a more and more experienced focuser is this notion of, what am I feeling?
Mm-hmm.
And am I really in touch with emotions, or am I in touch with some belief I've got about something that's going on? So to say that something feels safe to me, I'm really talking about a belief that it's safe, and a feeling in the background of afraid if it isn't safe. I wanted to put that out there because it colors very strongly how I go about focusing, and especially how I go about interaction.
Yeah, that really brings to mind, as you say those words, for me, something, I learned from Anne with this, which is that sort of concept of radical acceptance. And that was very liberating for me. The notion that whatever's happening within you, it's just you. And it's kind of okay. And accepting that it's going on within you is, a beginning part of process, but one that is sort of, that initial step of acceptance was a big, big factor in safety, because the safety was no longer sort of dependent on someone else. For me, in my experience. So, but I mean, you just sort of brought up a couple of things that I'd like to talk about with interactive focusing. And I mean, it's not something I know a lot about. And I'm wondering if you could share with me a little bit about interactive focusing.
Gladly. It's my, well, I can't say it's my favorite practice, but it's certainly in the top 10. As I mentioned earlier, met Masumi Maeda, who is from Japan. And I met her in a class we were both taking that did not have to do with interactive focusing. I don't think I had even heard about the form at that point. She and I became focusing partners in traditional focusing, but relatively soon it came to light that she has been practicing and teaching interactive focusing, especially in Japan, for some years. And she offered to teach it to me in our partnership. And I love to learn new things, so of course I said yes. And then I began to study. I read some articles about it. I began to talk with other people about it, other focusers. And at the same time, this terrible tragedy happened. One of the two people who developed it, Dr. Janet Klein, passed away quite suddenly in early 2010. And so she had produced a fair number of articles about it. She also had worked on the practice with Dr. Mary McGuire, who used to be the head of the Focusing Institute a long time ago, and is now in Canada, heading up a church up there. She's not very active in our focusing world, although she has appeared a couple of times. And the two of them took this notion of interaction in a focusing partnership and expanded on it and turned it into a practice with teachable steps. The origin of it was Janet Klein's interest in what is it that happens in a focusing partnership. And for a piece of work that she was doing, she studied several long-term focusing partnerships that had this special quality to them of being extremely positive for both partners. And what came out of her study was the concept that eventually she and Mary McGuire called the double empathic moment. Now that's the practice form of it. That's what you do in an interactive focusing session. But what the double empathic moment acknowledges is that when the listener is attending the focuser, they're not just an empty vessel. They're a human being with their own inner world, and what they listen to can have an impact on them. I would argue it almost always has, or always has, an impact on them. And that impact can be very light, maybe even unnoticeable, or it can be very heavy and noticeable.
Mm-hmm.
So interactive focusing in the first instance acknowledges that there is an impact, there is a response, there's something in the listener that happens when the focuser does their focusing.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just pause there. There's more to say,
Mm-hmm.
but see if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm very curious about the double empathic moment, and a little bit about process. Like, if you could maybe model the sort of moments that precede a double empathic moment, and then how that is dealt with in interactive focusing.
Okay. So one thing I want to say to sort of adjust or give a little bit more context to something that I just said is, I didn't mean to imply that this doesn't happen anywhere but in an interactive focusing session. What I think that Doctors Klein and McGuire were noticing was that there's always a response from any human being in any interaction and in any focusing session, which is an interaction, or any focusing partnership, rather. So, but we're taught in traditional focusing that whatever comes up in us when we're the listener, we set it aside. It does not have a role in the partnership.
Yeah, it's the focuser's time.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what comes up in me when I'm listening to you might inform my subsequent focusing turn,
mm-hmm.
which is okay as long as I don't trespass on your content. But what happens in an interactive session, so I'm going to answer your question in reverse order. I'm going to give you sort of how we get started.
Okay.
And then I'll talk about what the double empathic moment is. One of the key differences between a traditional focusing session and an interactive focusing session is that the focuser really has to tell some story. There are many, many people, especially people who do focusing in business, who can keep their content to themselves. They can keep the story to themselves and just deal with the felt senses. And that maintains a certain level of privacy for them in what might not feel like entirely safe circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
But in interactive focusing, it's necessary that the focuser tell a bit of the story. So the first part of the focuser's turn is, here's my story. And the second part of the focuser's turn is, and here's the felt sense of it. And just as in traditional focusing, they go inside, they see what's there regarding this particular story. But the listener has some context.
Mm.
The focuser goes through their process, their time is up. The listener has reflected whatever the focuser wanted reflected, and we talk about in interactive the focuser as teacher. They're going to teach the listener what it is they want reflected.
Okay.
We reach the end of the focuser's time for story and felt sensing, and then there's the double empathic moment, which is when the focuser becomes quiet and sits with what they have, and the listener takes inside the essence of how it is for that focuser, attempts to capture that essence, bring it inside, and see what symbol might come, what symbolic expression might come of that focuser's essence that they can then express very briefly to the focuser. The focuser takes that expression and takes it inside and sees, does that fit my experience, what's happening for me right now? Does it not fit? And can say, that fits very well, or that fits with a little adjustment, or that doesn't really fit.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter getting it right. That's not what this is about. It matters the attempt to capture the essence of how it is for the focuser, because what the listener is doing is responding empathically to the focuser. The focuser isn't just heard by somebody who can repeat their words or reflect with paraphrasing. They're being heard empathically inside the listener, who then symbolizes it and expresses it. And I'll just pause there, see if that makes sense.
Stay tuned for part 2 of our podcast with Barbara Dickinson and our focusing-oriented conversation about interactive focusing. You've been listening to The Focusing Way podcast, available on iTunes and Stitcher. I'm your host, David Battistella. Please visit our website at thefocusingway.com.